The first thing Dr. Marcus Ellison did every morning at Mercy General Hospital was check the board. Not the patient board, not the surgical schedule. The whiteboard mounted just outside OR Suite 4, where the overnight charge nurse, a woman named Dolores, always wrote the hardest cases in red marker. Red meant complicated. Red meant someone had called in a favor. Red meant the margin between alive and not alive was thin enough to see through. That particular Tuesday in November, there were 3 names in red. Marcus looked at them without moving. He was standing in the hallway in fresh scrubs, a cup of coffee he hadn't tasted yet in his left hand, the overhead lights casting the particular institutional white that makes everyone look slightly wrong. He read the names once, set down the coffee, went to scrub in. He didn't eat breakfast before cases like these. Hadn't for 21 years. The first patient that morning was a 68-year-old retired teacher named Dorothea Cleves, who had presented the night before with a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm. The admitting attending had classified her as high-risk, borderline unsurvivable, and had flagged the case for Marcus specifically because there were cases where the statistics said no, and you needed someone who understood that statistics weren't the same as the patient lying in front of you. Marcus understood that. He had understood it since medical school, when his mentor, a vascular surgeon named Dr. Abioye, who wore reading glasses on a chain and never raised his voice in any operating room. He stood in, told him once, "The data tells you what happens to populations. The patient in front of you is not a population. She is a specific person. Treat her like one." Marcus had never forgotten that. He thought about it now as he stood over Dorothea Cleves at 6:47 in the morning. Her abdomen opened the aneurysm, a dangerous bulge that had been quietly building for years without her knowing it, waiting for exactly this moment to announce itself. "BPA," he said. 72/44, the anesthesiologist, Dr. Fiona Park, answered without looking up from her panel. Her voice was steady. It was the voice of someone who had been in rooms like this before and had learned that steadiness was a form of professionalism. "Let's move," Marcus said. Not loud, not urgent, just clear. His hands moved the way they had moved 10,000 times before, with the particular economy of motion that only comes from years of repetition, and a kind of attention so absolute that the world outside the sterile field ceases to exist entirely. Outside these walls there were things: morning traffic on Halstead Avenue, the smell of autumn coming in under the loading dock doors, a text message from his daughter about a school event he hadn't written down, the specific low-grade hum of a hospital managing 312 patients across 7 floors. None of it touched him in here. In here there was only this: the field, the vessels, the work. He clamped, he sutured, he replaced. At 8:09 in the morning, Dorothea Cleves's blood pressure climbed to 104/68. Her vitals steadied. The monitors settled into a rhythm that meant she was going to see tomorrow. Marcus stepped back from the table, pulled off his outer gloves, looked at the scrub tech across from him, a young man named Danny, who always wore the same brand of sneakers, white ones, that he kept impeccably clean because he said the OR was the one place in his life where things should be exact, and nodded once. "Close her up clean," Marcus said. "She earned it." He went to the sink and stood there for a moment with the cold water running over his wrists, letting the temperature pull him back into his own body. The particular decompression after a hard case. The slow return. He thought, as he often did at this moment, about the version of himself that had stood in a hospital corridor in Chicago 23 years ago, 26 years old and freshly minted with a medical degree and a surgical residency acceptance, and absolutely no understanding yet of what any of it would actually cost him. The hours, the years of subordinating every other part of himself to this work. The relationships that hadn't survived the combination of his schedule and his attention, and his inability to be fully present anywhere except the places where it mattered most. He didn't regret it. That was the complicated truth he carried. He had built a life that consisted almost entirely of the things he was best at. He was good at this work in a way that went beyond training. It was a kind of gift, and he had spent 21 years honoring it. What he hadn't spent much time doing was explaining himself to people who didn't already know. That would matter later. In the next several hours, when everything else about this day changed. There is a particular smell in an operating suite that you never forget once you've learned to associate it with work. Not blood has its own smell, distinct and specific, and experienced surgeons stop registering it as a separate sensory event sometime in their second year of residency. The operating room smell is older and more complex. The antiseptic clean of the prep solution, the particular warmth of recirculated filtered air, the faint metallic presence of the instruments in their trays, and underneath all of it something harder to name, the smell of a room where the work is serious, where the stakes are present, where everything that doesn't belong has been excluded. Marcus had been stepping into that smell for 21 years. It still meant something to him. He would have been worried about himself if it stopped meaning something. The scrub sink outside OR Suite 4 had a particular soap dispenser that had been badly calibrated since spring and always gave you 3 times as much soap as you needed. The overflow was a minor irritation that Marcus had logged a maintenance request about twice and then stopped mentioning because there were larger maintenance problems in the building, and the soap, in the end, worked. He scrubbed his hands and forearms with the unnecessary foam and thought about Dorothea Cleaves's scan and the specific challenge of the aneurysm's location and whether the second team would be on time and what he was going to have for lunch if there was time between cases. Small thoughts, ordinary thoughts, the mental furniture of a morning. In 4 hours he would be in handcuffs on the side of Meridian Drive. He did not know this. He stood at the scrub sink with soap that was calibrated wrong and thought about a woman's aorta and the morning's work ahead of him, and pushed through the OR doors and said to the room, "Good morning, everybody. Let's get to work." The monitors beeped their reassurance. The instruments were laid out in the precise order that Tracy, his favorite scrub tech, always prepared them, smallest to largest along one axis, most frequently used toward the near side. He had worked with Tracy long enough that the setup was automatic between them, a professional fluency. He glanced at it, confirmed the arrangement, looked at the patient on the table. Dorothea Cleaves, 68, retired teacher, grandmother of 4, who had spent 30 years educating other people's children in underfunded schools, and who had been told in 3 different ways by 3 different people in the last 24 hours that her odds of surviving the morning were not favorable. He looked at her. "Good morning, Dorothea," he said, though she was anesthetized and could not hear him. He said it anyway. He had always said it anyway. Then he began. The town of Hartwell Crossing, Georgia, sat 40 minutes south of Atlanta, along a state highway that passed through pine forest and flat farmland. Before the commercial strip began a Target, a Chick-fil-A, a Home Depot, a string of chain restaurants, and then the older residential neighborhoods spreading out behind them in concentric rings. The newer developments were to the north. The older money was on the east side in the neighborhood called Whitmore Hills, where the lots were large and the trees were old, and the homeowners association sent strongly worded letters about trash can visibility and the precise dimensions of acceptable mailbox installations. Hartwell Crossing was the kind of place that appeared from a certain angle to be exactly what it presented as: comfortable, orderly, clean. From another angle, it was something else. The police department had 14 sworn officers, a chief who had been in the role for 9 years, and a budget that the county commission had voted to increase for the 4th consecutive year, without, according to 3 separate audit reports, any corresponding data showing where the previous increases had gone. Chief Dale Burgess ran the department the way a man runs something he considers his personal property. He had been hired laterally from a neighboring county where he'd spent 16 years in various supervisory roles, and he had brought with him a particular style of leadership that his officers understood immediately He protected the people who were loyal to him, and he made things difficult for the ones who weren't. Nobody filed complaints about what happened in Hartwell Crossing because the complaint process ran through Burgess's office, and everyone understood what that meant. In 9 years, 7 excessive force complaints had been filed against officers under his command. 6 had been classified as unfounded during internal review. 1 had resulted in a written reprimand that was later expunged from the officer's file after 18 months of what Burgess described in the expungement paperwork as exemplary service. Not one officer had been terminated. Not one complaint had been referred to an outside body. The county commissioner who might have pushed for oversight had been golfing with Burgess on the same Thursday morning for 6 years running. That was the structure, that was the system. It had worked in the sense that it had remained intact for nearly a decade. And then Marcus Ellison moved to Whitmore Hills. Marcus left the hospital at 6:34 in the evening. His second surgery of the day had been a 4-hour vascular repair on a 41-year-old man named Kevin Trott, who had presented with acute mesenteric ischemia, a condition where the blood supply to part of the intestine is suddenly cut off, which requires fast diagnosis, faster surgical response, and a particular kind of sustained technical attention over a long operating window. Kevin Trott was in the ICU, now sedated stable, with a recovery timeline that Marcus had been careful not to make sound too optimistic, because vascular cases had a way of humbling you if you started speaking in certainties. He had also, in between surgeries, sat for 40 minutes with the family of a 17-year-old who had come in the previous night following a car accident and who had not made it despite everything his team had done. Those conversations were the part nobody prepared you for in medical school. The standing in a small family room with the wrong expression on someone's face when you walked in. The words you had said so many times that you sometimes heard them from the outside like a recording and still felt the weight of each one as if it were the first time. He walked to his car in the physician parking structure with the particular exhaustion of a day that had asked everything of him and received it. Not a depleted exhaustion, more like the specific tiredness of a machine that has operated at full capacity and now needs to power down. His mind was still moving, cataloging the way it always was. The morning case's follow-up scan was scheduled for Thursday. Kevin Trott's wound care protocol needed to be confirmed with the ICU team before morning. There was a departmental meeting on Friday that he had been asked to chair in the chief of staff's absence. He settled into the driver's seat of his Jeep Grand Cherokee, dark blue, 4 years old, meticulously maintained. He had bought it because his daughter had asked him once, half joking, why he always drove the kind of car that said, "I have given up." He had traded in the beige sedan the following week. That had been 3 years ago. His daughter was 17 now and did not remember the conversation, but he still thought about it sometimes when he got into the car. He plugged his phone into the charger, opened the navigation app out of habit, though he had driven this route every weekday for 2 years and knew it by feel. Set it going anyway because the routing sometimes caught accident delays on 985 before he hit them. The drive from Mercy General to Whitmore Hills was 41 minutes without traffic. Tonight, with a minor slowdown on the connector, it would be closer to 52. He pulled out of the parking structure at 6:36. He did not know at 6:36 that the next 2 hours would constitute the single most consequential evening of his professional life. Not because of anything that had happened inside the hospital, because of what was waiting for him on the far side of his front door. He drove carefully. He always drove carefully in Hartwell Crossing. He had been driving carefully in towns like this one for 32 years, since his father had taught him in a parking lot in Memphis when he was 16, and had told him with the particular seriousness of a man who is not having a conversation but issuing instructions for survival. You drive like every stop sign is a test, because sometimes it is. The speed limit on Meridian Drive was 35. Marcus set his cruise control to 33. He noticed the cruiser parked in the gas station lot. at the corner of Meridian and Beaumont. The officer inside, the way the cruiser's engine was idling, these things registered in the part of his brain that had been trained to register them. He drove past at 33 miles per hour. The cruiser pulled out behind him. The lights came on 3 blocks later in front of a dry cleaner that had gone out of business, its windows papered over with the ghost shapes of old promotional signage underneath new paper. Marcus felt his stomach tighten in the specific way it always tightened, the involuntary physical response that 21 years of professional achievement and 3 years of living in a safe neighborhood in a good part of the county and a surgical career that had saved more than 4,000 lives had done absolutely nothing to prevent. It was not fear exactly. It was the body's memory of what these situations could become stored in a place that rational thought could not entirely reach. He signaled, pulled to the curb, turned off the engine, put both hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2 fingers spread where they could be clearly seen, reached over and turned off the radio which had been playing a jazz station, placed the radio silence in the car, sat still. He watched in the rearview mirror as the officer, big man, broad through the shoulders, moving with the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone who has never felt the need to move quickly, approached on the driver's side. A second officer emerged from the passenger side of the cruiser, came around the back of Marcus's Jeep, stationed herself on the passenger side. Standard 2-officer stop. Marcus cataloged this automatically. The window was already down. The first officer appeared in it. Late 40s, Marcus estimated. Sandy hair, pinkish complexion, jaw set. His name, as Marcus would learn hours later from the incident report, was Sergeant Victor Crane. License and registration, Crane said. Not a greeting, an order. Of course, Marcus said. His voice was level. He had spent years cultivating this particular levelness, the vocal equivalent of his hands on the wheel. My wallet is in my left front pocket. I'd like to let you know before I reach for it. Crane said nothing. His eyes moved over the interior of the Jeep with the deliberate assessment of someone looking for something without being certain what it is. The medical bag on the passenger seat, the hospital ID clipped to the visor, the surgical scheduling app open on the phone in the cup holder. Marcus reached slowly, produced his wallet, offered it through the window. Crane took it, opened it, looked at the license, looked at Marcus, looked at the license again, handed back the wallet without the registration. This your vehicle? Yes, sir. You sure about that? It was not phrased as a question. I'm sure, Marcus said. Crane's eyes went to the hospital ID on the visor. That real? It is. I'm a surgeon at Mercy General. I'm coming home from work. Step out of the vehicle. Marcus breathed slowly through his nose. May I ask what I've been stopped for? I'll ask the questions. Step out. He had everything to lose by getting out of that car, and everything to lose by refusing. Think about that for a moment. What would you have done in his position? When the system puts you in a place where every choice carries risk, what do you do? Drop your answer in the comments. And if this story is making you feel something right now, hit that like button. It helps other people find stories like this one. Marcus opened the door slowly, kept his movements visible and deliberate, stepped onto the curb with his hands at the shoulder height. Crane was behind him before Marcus had fully turned around, hand at his back, pressing him toward the Jeep. Hands on the vehicle. Marcus placed his palms flat on the roof of the Jeep. The metal was cool. The October evening air came in off the pine trees at the edge of the road and moved against the back of his neck. The second officer, Rollins Marcus, would learn. Her name was Rollins, appeared on his right. She had her hand near her holster but had not drawn. She was watching Crane. Marcus noticed. Not watching Marcus, watching Crane. There was something in her expression that Marcus registered without having time to interpret. Crane grabbed Marcus's left wrist, pulled it behind his back. I'm going to need you to come with us. On what charge? Marcus asked. His voice remained level. He was making himself keep it level. It was taking more effort than it had taken to keep his hands steady over a bleeding vessel at 6:47 in the morning. Suspicion, Crane said. Suspicion of what? We received a call, Crane said, matching your description. Suspicious individual in the neighborhood. Marcus said nothing for a moment. He understood with perfect clarity the architecture of what was happening. He had been driving 33 miles per hour in a 35 zone. He had committed no traffic violation. There was no probable cause that could survive even basic legal scrutiny. He understood all of this. He also understood that this was not a conversation where legal scrutiny was currently relevant. I'd like to call my attorney, Marcus said. Crane clicked the handcuff on his left wrist. You can do that from the station. The second cuff went on, cold, precise, the ratcheting sound of it loud in the quiet street. A couple walking a dog on the opposite sidewalk had stopped. The woman had her hand over her mouth. The man had his phone out. Marcus noted this. He noted everything. The couple walking the dog on the opposite side of Meridian Drive had not intended to witness anything that evening. They were out because their dog, a 6-year-old beagle named Cooper, who had opinions about his evening schedule, had refused to wait any longer, and because walking Cooper was one of the reliable pleasures of the evening, the kind of thing that got you out of the house and into the October air and made you feel slightly more alive than the alternative of staying in. They had turned onto Meridian from Hawthorne Street and were 3 houses up when the cruiser's lights came on behind the dark blue Jeep. They stopped automatically, not because they had decided to watch, because movement stops when lights flash in a quiet street. The body responds before the mind catches up. What they saw over the next 6 minutes was this. A man black in what looked like medical scrubs exit the Jeep, slowly and carefully, hands visible, moving in a way that telegraphed deliberate compliance with the kind of precision that people who have practiced it long use. The officer who had approached the car, large man, moving with the unhurried certainty of authority, stationed him against the vehicle. The second officer circling to the other side. The first officer removing something from the car, a badge or ID, something laminated. Then the cuffs. The walk to the cruiser. The woman had her hand over her mouth by the point where the cuffs went on, not because she had done anything, because she was watching something happen that her body understood before her mind had formulated the words for it. Her husband had his phone out. He was recording. He had started recording at the moment the officer pushed the man toward the vehicle, because something in the geometry of the scene, the specific posture of authority, the specific posture of compliance, the specific space between them, told him that this was the kind of thing that needed a record. Should we? She started. I'm recording, he said. They stood on the sidewalk until the cruiser pulled away. Then the woman bent down and put her hand on Cooper's back for a moment, the way people touch something present and familiar when the world has just shown them something that will be hard to put away. Her husband uploaded the video that night. It was not the video that drove the investigation. The dash cam footage was cleaner, more complete, more legally useful. But the uploaded video existed. It circulated. It was one of the things that transformed what might have remained a contained administrative matter into something public, something legible to people who had not been there and who needed to understand what kind of evening it had been on Meridian Drive. The woman sent Marcus a letter 11 months later after she had seen his name in the coverage of the GPS TC panel findings. She had written it several times and thrown away the earlier drafts because she could not find the right thing to say. The final version was 4 sentences. The last one said, I am sorry we did not do more in the moment. I don't know what more would have been. Marcus wrote back. His response was also short. He said, you recorded it. That was the right thing. Thank you. He was walked to the cruiser and placed in the back seat. Through the window, he watched Crane go back to his Jeep. Watched Crane lean in through the open driver's side window and examine the interior. Watched him open the passenger door and look at the medical bag. Watched him take the hospital aid card off the visor. The second officer, Rollins, stood by the back of the cruiser. She was not looking at Marcus. She was looking at the couple across the street. She put her hand up slightly, not a wave, not a greeting, something in between. The couple did not lower their phones. Crane came back, got in the cruiser, started it. They pulled away from the curb. The drive from Meridian Drive to the Hartwell Crossing police station took 11 minutes. Marcus counted them. He also counted the turns left on Beaumont, right on Callaway left into the station lot. He noted the cross streets as they passed them. He noted the time on the cruiser's dashboard clock when they pulled into the lot 716. He noted the name of the detention facility written in block letters above the entrance, Hartwell Crossing Police Department Municipal Services. In the back seat of the cruiser, with his hands in cuffs behind him and the plastic seat divider pressing into his right shoulder because the angle was wrong and he had not been seated carefully, Marcus did what he always did in situations that required something from him. He organized. He thought about his options in sequence. Option 1, demand his rights loudly, cite specific statutes, refuse to proceed without legal counsel present. This option had the advantage of being completely legally justified. It had the disadvantage of creating conditions in which Crane, who had already demonstrated a willingness to act without factual basis, might escalate. In a locked cruiser, escalation was not a direction Marcus was interested in. Option 2, cooperate entirely, provide complete and accurate information in every context, and let the record build itself. Say nothing that was not factual. Ask for nothing except what he was entitled to in terms that could not be misconstrued. Generate the cleanest possible documentation trail for the subsequent legal and administrative processes that were from this moment inevitable. He had chosen option 2 before the cruiser reached Beaumont Street. He also thought in the back of the cruiser about something his mentor, Dr. Abioye, had told him in his first year of residency when Marcus had made a technical error in a procedure and had spent 3 days afterward in a state of controlled self-recrimination that expressed itself as excessive meticulousness and an inability to let the case go. Abioye had called him into his office and said, "You are confusing the error with the response to the error. The error happened. It is part of the record now. What is not yet part of the record is what you do next. That is the part that is still in your control. Put your energy there." Marcus had put his energy there. He had always put his energy there, in the things that were still in his control, which was where energy did the most work. In the cruiser, his energy was going into observation documentation and the specific patience that comes from understanding that the next room is not the last room, that the cell is not the end of the story, that the person who has been handed the worst situation in this evening is not necessarily the person who is going to lose. He breathed through the 11 minutes. He noted the time. He watched the streetlights of Hartwell Crossing pass in their intervals through the window. He thought about his daughter. He thought about the morning and the whiteboard and the red names and the particular smell of the scrub sink. He thought, I am going to get through this, and then the work is going to begin. He was right onto both counts. Marcus sat in the back seat with his hands cuffed behind him and looked out the window and made himself breathe and made himself observe and made himself above all stay calm. Not because he was not angry. He was. He was furious in a way that sat in his chest like a stone, and that he knew with the certainty of long practice he could not afford to let become visible right now. He thought about his daughter, about the dinner he was not going to make it home for, about the text message he had sent her from the parking structure that said, "On my way home by 7:30. He thought about the 3 red names on Dolores's whiteboard this morning. He thought about Dorothea Cleves, who was almost certainly in the recovery ward right now alive because of what his hands had done this morning. He thought about what Chief Dale Burgess did not yet know. The Hartwell Crossing police station was a low-rise brick building on Callaway Street, with a parking lot that needed resurfacing and a lobby that smelled of coffee and the particular institutional staleness that accumulates in buildings where the air handlers have not been serviced in several years. Marcus was brought in through the side entrance at 7:22 in the evening. He knew the time because there was a clock on the wall of the processing area, large-faced and fluorescent lit. The kind of clock that exists in spaces where time is the primary administrative unit. He noted the time, the way he noted every detail in the next 40 minutes. the name of the booking officer, Tillman, according to his nameplate, the number of cells visible through the interior door. 4-2 occupied the location of the security cameras, 2-1 covering the processing desk, 1 covering the holding area and the contents of the evidence bag that Crane placed on the booking counter, which contained Marcus's wallet, his phone, his car keys, and his Mercy General Hospital identification card. Tillman looked at the ID card without expression and slid it into the bag. "I need to make a phone call," Marcus said. His voice was even. He had been saying this to himself for the last 15 minutes in the back of Crane's cruiser, practicing the specific tone he was going to need, not angry, not pleading, simply stating a fact. "I'm entitled to a phone call." "You'll get that," Tillman said, without looking up from the keyboard where he was entering Marcus's information. "After processing." "I'm a physician at Mercy General Hospital," Marcus said. "I have patients in critical care who may need my direct authorization for treatment decisions. This is a matter of patient safety which supersedes standard processing procedure." Tillman stopped typing, looked at Marcus for the first time. "You saying you're a doctor?" "Yes." Tillman looked at the hospital ID in the evidence bag, looked at Marcus again, then looked at Crane, who had appeared in the doorway behind Marcus. Some kind of communication passed between them that Marcus could not read. "Processing first," Crane said. Tillman went back to the keyboard. Marcus stood at the booking counter with his hands now freed from the cuffs. They had removed the cuffs for processing and made the calculation that he had been making since the moment the cruiser's lights appeared in his rearview mirror. He could make this loud. He could recite federal statutes on unlawful detention, which he knew well enough to cite by number. He could invoke his rights to a phone call in terms that would be difficult to ignore. He could, in short, push back in every way available to him right now. Or he could let this proceed, document everything, and use the information accumulated in this room later in a different room where the person asking the questions would not be wearing a badge. He chose the second option, not because he was afraid, because he was a surgeon, and surgeons understand that the right intervention at the wrong moment can cause more damage than the underlying problem. Timing was everything. He answered every question Tillman asked him with accurate, complete information delivered without elaboration and without visible emotion. Name, address, date of birth, employment. He did not volunteer the specific information about his position that would later become relevant. He was not hiding it. He simply was not offering it. Let the record show what the record would show. He was escorted to a holding cell at 7:44 in the evening. The cell was 7 feet by 9 feet, painted a gray beige that had seen better decades, with a metal bench bolted to one wall and a drain in the concrete floor. The smell was bleach over something else, the palimpsest of institutional occupancy. A vent in the ceiling moved air that was slightly warmer than the air in the processing room. Marcus sat on the metal bench, pressed his back against the wall, put his hands flat on his thighs, and looked at the opposite wall and breathed slow and all the way down. He thought about a night 26 years ago, when he was a third-year medical student doing a trauma rotation, standing in an ER bay at 2 a.m. while a man with a GSW to the abdomen bled out on the table despite everything they did. His attending had put a hand on his shoulder afterward and said, "You're going to carry some of these. That's not failure, that's the job." Marcus had thought at the time that the comment was about failure and grief. He understood now, with all the additional years between then and this moment, that it was about something else. It was about the ones you couldn't save, and how you found a way to go back into the OR the next morning regardless. He found in this moment that what he was feeling was not entirely different. He was not going to be here long. He knew this with a certainty that was not bravado, but calculation. He knew exactly who he was going to call the moment they gave him a phone, and he knew within a predictable range what was going to happen after that call. He had constructed enough understanding of how institutional authority worked from decades of operating within large hospital systems, navigating insurance carriers, presenting to medical boards, To know that what had happened to him tonight had a particular trajectory that people like Crane and Tillman had not calculated. They thought they understood who they had in this cell. They were going to discover they were wrong. He sat in the cell and waited and breathed and thought about Dorothea Cleves's blood pressure climbing to 104/68 and the way Danny the scrub tech had looked across the table at him when the monitors steadied, and the specific silence of an OR when the hard part is over. He waited. What Marcus did in that cell for the 2 hours and 11 minutes he was in it was organize. Not his thoughts. His thoughts were already organized, had been organized since the moment the cruiser pulled out behind him on Meridian Drive with the particular intention that moves differently from a routine traffic enforcement maneuver. He had recognized the intention before the lights came on. He had felt the nature of it, and he had begun in that recognition the mental process that his training and his years and his particular kind of intelligence made available to him, the process of converting experience into documentation. In medicine, there is a practice called a running log, a real-time record of events in a critical situation maintained simultaneously with the work of responding to it. It exists because in a crisis, the sequence of events matters enormously, both for the patient and for the record that will be reviewed afterward. Every action taken, every decision made, every piece of information received, time-stamped, sequential, complete. Not because the people in the room are thinking about the record, because the record is the only thing that makes accountability possible after the fact. Marcus had kept a running log in his head from the moment the cruiser lights appeared. 7:03. Stop initiated on Meridian Drive between Callaway and Beaumont. No stated moving violation. Both hands visible on wheel from first moment of approach. 7:07 exit from vehicle requested without stated probable cause. 7:09 handcuffed. No Miranda statement provided. 7:22 arrived at station. 7:44 placed in holding cell without access to phone. He noted the temperature of the cell as cooler than the processing room by approximately 4 degrees detail, irrelevant to the legal record but possibly relevant to a future account of conditions. He noted the absence of any sleeping surface other than the metal bench and the absence of any provision of food and the time of his last meal, which had been a sandwich at 1:15 in the afternoon between his 2 surgeries, and the fact that he had been on his feet for most of the preceding 12 hours. None of this was unusual. He was not unaccustomed to long days. The difference was the absence of purpose in this particular fatigue. In the OR, exhaustion was the price of something that mattered. Here it was just the passage of time in a room where the air was stale and the light was wrong. He did not allow himself to be angry, or rather he was angry, and he chose to hold it at a distance the way you hold a scalpel present in hand, but controlled its use determined by the surgeon and not by the instrument. His daughter would be texting. He had not come home at 7:30. He had not texted back. She was 17 and smart and would be frightened in a way that would come out as irritation when they spoke, and he was already rehearsing how he would explain this to her in a way that was honest without being alarming, because she was 17 and he was her father, and the combination of those 2 facts imposed a particular kind of responsibility on how he described the world to her. He thought about the patients on the floor tonight, about the ICU, about Kevin Trott's wound care protocol, which he had not yet confirmed with the night team. He had given Fiona Park a verbal handoff before leaving the hospital, and Fiona was excellent, and Kevin was stable. There was no emergent concern. But he thought about it anyway because he was a surgeon, and thinking about his patients was what he did when there was nothing else to do, the same way other people might think about their families, or their mortgages, or their plans for the weekend. His patients were always with him in some portion of his attention, not intrusively, just present the way background knowledge is present, available to be accessed the moment it becomes relevant. He breathed, he waited, he organized. When Corporal Weems opened the cell door and told him someone would be in to speak with him shortly, Marcus had already anticipated the sequence that would follow Constance Webb's call by approximately 40 minutes. He had given it some margin for variables: the time it would take Patterson to make his calls, the time it would take those calls to produce a response, the time it would take that response to reach a person in this building with sufficient authority to understand its implications. He had estimated between 90 minutes and 2 hours. It had taken 2 hours and 4 minutes. Close enough. The call that changed everything. It was 9:18 in the evening when Tillman opened the cell door and told Marcus he had 5 minutes to make a call. They gave him back his phone still in the evidence bag and told him to make the call at the processing desk under observation. Marcus took the phone, did not look at the messages that had accumulated. He could see in the preview that there were 11 of them, including several from his daughter and one from the hospital's after-hours surgical coordinator, and dialed a number he knew by memory. It rang twice. Marcus. The voice that answered was a woman's mid-50s, the kind of voice that had been refined over decades into something that was simultaneously warm and entirely implacable. Her name was Constance Webb. She was the chief of staff at Mercy General Hospital. She had been Marcus's direct supervisor for 2 years, his professional mentor for 7, and someone he had called exactly twice before in a situation that required immediate action from a person with sufficient institutional authority to compel it. Constance, Marcus said. He kept his voice low and precise. I'm at the Hartwell Crossing police station. I've been detained. I need you to contact Dr. Philip Hargrove at the hospital and let him know that I'm unavailable for the evening. A brief silence. Constance Webb processed information quickly. It was one of the things Marcus most respected about her. Detained how? Traffic stop. No violation. Suspicion of being in my own neighborhood. Another silence. When she spoke again, her voice had changed slightly. It had the particular quality of someone who has shifted from listening to planning. Are you safe? I am. I'm going to need you to make a second call. Tell me. I need you to call General Patterson's office, his personal line, not the office line. Tell him where I am and that it happened the way I'll explain when I'm out. The longest silence yet. Marcus, Constance said, and there was something in her voice that he recognized, a combination of controlled alarm and specific fury that she was applying considerable effort to contain. General Patterson is going to want to know what to do when he calls. Tell him I said invoke the protocol, Marcus said. He'll know what that means. He hung up and returned the phone to Tillman. He went back to the cell. He sat down on the metal bench and waited. And for the first time all evening, something that was almost calm settled into him. Not resignation, not acceptance. The specific equanimity of a man who has set things in motion and who understands with professional certainty exactly what comes next. He had just made 2 phone calls. 2. And in that moment, he hadn't raised his voice, hadn't threatened anyone, hadn't lost control. He simply called in something he'd built over decades. Here's what I want to ask you. Do you think staying calm in a situation like this is strength or something he had no other choice about? What would have been different if he'd fought back right there? Think on it and drop your thoughts in the comments. If you're watching this and you want more stories about people who turn injustice into reckoning, subscribe our channel. We put these out regularly. Brigadier General Raymond Patterson, retired, was 61 years old, 6'4", and had spent 32 years in the United States Army before retiring at the rank of 1-star general after a career that had included 2 combat commands, 4 years as a Pentagon liaison to the Joint Chiefs, and a final posting as commanding general of the Army's Medical Command, where he had overseen the largest military medical infrastructure in the world. He was now the executive director of the Hargrove Institute for Medical Excellence, a research and policy organization housed at Emory University, and he served on the boards of 3 hospital systems, one of which was the regional health network that included Mercy General Hospital. He had known Marcus Ellison for 11 years since Marcus had operated on his wife following a thoracic aortic dissection that 3 other surgeons in 3 different cities had told them carried a survival probability below 30%. Marcus had performed the surgery in 4.5 hours, and Patricia Patterson had walked out of the hospital 11 days later. Raymond Patterson did not forget things like that. He also sat on the Community Advisory Board for the Georgia Department of Public Safety. He also was personal friends with the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia. He also had, over the course of a 32-year military career, developed relationships with people in federal law enforcement at levels that most civilians did not know existed. When Constance Webb called him at 9:24 in the evening and told him what had happened, he listened without interrupting, asked 3 specific questions, received 3 specific answers, and then said, "I know Marcus." He said, "Invoke the protocol. That means he wants documentation before intervention. He's collecting his record." "He's been in that cell for 2 hours," Constance said. "I know." A brief pause. "Let him have until 10 o'clock. Then I make the call that ends this." Constance was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, she said, "Raymond, who do you call?" "Everyone," Patterson said simply. "I call everyone." He ended the call, sat for a moment in the leather chair in around his home office with the lights of Atlanta visible through the window. Then he opened his contacts and began. Not 1 call, not 2. 7 calls placed in sequence to 7 people whose positions collectively constituted the entire institutional hierarchy that the Hartwell Crossing Police Department had never imagined would need to know what happened in a holding cell on Callaway Street on a Tuesday evening in November. The 7th call, placed at 9:51, was to a deputy assistant director at the FBI's Atlanta field office who had been in Raymond Patterson's company commander school class 30 years ago. That call lasted 4 minutes. At 10:17 in the evening, the phone at the Hartwell Crossing Police Station's front desk rang. The desk officer, a young man named Corporal Weems, who had been on the job for 7 months and who had spent the last 2 hours reading sports analysis on his phone, picked it up on the second ring. He listened for 38 seconds. His expression over those 38 seconds changed in a way that the security camera above the desk recorded in full. It started neutral. It went through a sequence of adjustments that included confusion, increased attention, and then something else, a quality of directed seriousness that had not been on his face before the call began. "Yes, sir," he said. "I understand. Yes, sir, right away." He put down the phone, sat for a moment, then reached for the radio on his desk. "Sergeant Crane." Static. "Sergeant Crane, this is Weems at the front desk. I need you to come to the front." Static then, Crane's voice flat and mildly annoyed. "What is it, Weems?" "Sir, I've just received a call from..." Weems looked at the notepad where he had written the name. His voice changed slightly when he read it aloud. "From the office of Brigadier General Raymond Patterson. He's identified himself as being on the Community Advisory Board for the Department of Public Safety. He says he has documentation pertaining to a detainee held here tonight and that he will be arriving at the station in approximately 40 minutes. With sir," he said, with a federal désigné. The longest pause Marcus had heard yet on the radio channel. Then Crane's voice, stripped of its earlier authority, said, "A federal désignee." "Yes, sir. And sir, he also said to tell you that Deputy Assistant Director Mercer from the FBI field office has been informed and is monitoring the situation." Weems's voice stayed professional, admirably professional, Marcus would later think. "He said the detainee's name is Dr. Marcus Ellison. He asked me to confirm that Dr. Ellison is in good health and has been treated properly." Another silence. "Go check on the detainee," Crane said. His voice had changed. The authority was still there technically in the way that a building's structure can remain technically present after the foundation has given way, but something else had gone from it. "Tell him," a pause, "tell him someone will be in to speak with him shortly." Marcus heard Weems's footsteps approaching the cell before he saw him, heard the key in the lock. The door opened. Weems looked at Marcus with an expression that was trying very hard to be professionally neutral. "Dr. Ellison," he said, is there anything you need?" Marcus looked at him for a moment. "Water would be appreciated," he said. "Yes, sir." Weems hesitated. "Someone will be in to speak with you shortly." "I heard," Marcus said. Weems left. The door stayed open. 3 minutes later, a different officer appeared, not Crane, carrying a bottle of water and wearing an expression that Marcus recognized from hospital settings. It was the expression of someone who has just learned that they may have made a very significant error. "Dr. Ellison," the officer said, "is there anyone you'd like us to contact?" "I've already made my calls," Marcus said. He took the water. "Thank you." General Raymond Patterson arrived at the Hartwell Crossing police station at 11:04 in the evening. He did not come alone. His car, a dark SUV, pulled into the parking lot behind a black sedan with federal plates. From the federal sedan emerged 2 individuals, a man in a dark suit carrying a leather briefcase, who identified himself to the desk officer as Special Agent Terrence Holbrook from the FBI's Atlanta field office, and a woman in a gray blazer who presented credentials identifying her as an investigator from the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Georgia. Patterson himself stepped out of the SUV wearing a dark overcoat and carrying nothing. He was a large man, and he moved through the lobby of the Hartwell Crossing police station with the particular unhurried authority of someone who has walked into difficult rooms for 30 years and has no longer any uncertainty about what happens when he does. Sergeant Crane was standing in the lobby. He looked at the credentials. The lobby of the Hartwell Crossing police station was not designed for the kind of thing that was happening in it at 11:04 on a Tuesday night in November. It was designed for the ordinary traffic of a small city department, citizens coming to file reports, officers signing in and out, occasional family members arriving to collect people who had been processed and released. The fluorescent panels overhead had the particular tired quality of lights that are on continuously and have never been replaced on a schedule. The linoleum floor was clean but worn at the traffic lines. Darker paths where feet consistently walked, lighter patches where they didn't. There was a bulletin board on the left wall with community notices and a department calendar and a laminated sheet titled "Know Your Rights" that had been there long enough that the edges had curled. Behind the front desk, there was a photograph of the current department leadership. Chief Burgess in the center in full uniform, his officers arranged around him in 2 rows. The photograph had been taken at what appeared to be a department appreciation event. Everyone was smiling. Sergeant Crane was in the back row, on the right one, head taller than the officer next to him. His expression in the photograph, the expression of a man who is comfortable in the room. He is in and expects to remain so. At 11:04, that photograph was 6 feet from where Special Agent Terrence Holbrook was standing, and the man in it, who was now standing in the hallway near the holding area, looked nothing like the man in the photograph. The composure was the same technically. The physical arrangement was the same height, same shoulders, same jaw, but the certainty behind it was not. General Patterson moved through the lobby with the specific kind of presence that accrues to people who have spent decades in positions where their physical arrival constituted a statement before they opened their mouth. Not a large presence in the performative sense, not loud, not commanding attention by force of personality, simply large in the way that a structural element is large, occupying the necessary space and being, by virtue of that occupation, the thing around which other elements arrange themselves. Diane Coates from the U.S. Attorney's Office moved with a different kind of economy, smaller, quieter, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the expression of someone who has read the complete file and is operating from a position of information that the people in this room do not yet know she has. Her authority was not physical. It was documentary. It was the authority of someone who could, if the conversation required it, cite the specific federal statute and the specific case number and the specific procedural violation from memory without consulting the portfolio. Corporal Weems at the front desk had the expression of someone who is witnessing something he will describe to people for years, and who is in this moment very carefully trying to do exactly the right thing at exactly the right speed. The lobby was a small room. For the 47 seconds it took Patterson and Holbrook and Coates to move through it, it was one of the more significant rooms in Hartwell Crossing County. He looked at Patterson. He looked at Holbrook and the U.S. Attorney's investigator. Then he looked at the floor for a brief moment, and when he looked up again, something in his face had rearranged itself. "Where is Dr. Ellison?" Patterson said. "Sir, we have Dr. Ellison in." "I didn't ask what you have him in," Patterson said. His voice was not raised. It was, if anything, quieter than it had been when he entered. "I asked where he is." Crane led them to the holding area. Marcus heard the footsteps before the cell door opened, heard the volume of them, multiple people. He was standing when the door opened, not because he had been told to, but because something in the acoustic signature of the evening told him that standing was the right posture for what was about to happen. Patterson appeared in the doorway. Marcus looked at him. Patterson looked at Marcus. They had known each other for 11 years, and in that time had developed the particular vocabulary of two people who communicate most efficiently through understatement. "You look well," Patterson said. "I've been well," Marcus said. Patterson's jaw tightened once, barely visible. Then he stepped back and let Marcus walk out of the cell. The hallway outside the cell was crowded in a way that Marcus suspected the Hartwell Crossing police station had never been crowded before. Patterson, Holbrook from the FBI, the U.S. Attorney's investigator whose name Marcus would learn was Diane Coates, two officers who had materialized from somewhere and were standing against the far wall looking at the floor. Corporal Weems, whose face had the expression of someone watching an automobile accident in slow motion, and Sergeant Victor Crane, who was standing in the middle of the hallway with his hands at his sides and his face the color of old paper. Marcus came to a stop 3 feet in front of him. He did not feel the need to speak. He had known it was coming. He had calculated the sequence and the timing and the range of probable outcomes and had given himself a margin for variance that turned out to be accurate to 4 minutes. He had known that the cell door would open and that Patterson would be on the other side of it, and that what followed would begin the process that would result eventually in the specific reckoning that he had been composing in his head for 2 hours and 11 minutes. Knowing something is coming does not entirely prepare you for its arrival. When the door opened and Patterson appeared, Marcus felt something move through him that was not quite relief, and not quite the satisfaction of being right, and not quite anything else he had a precise word for. It was the physical experience of a long period of controlled compression, releasing the internal equivalent of a suture being removed after the wound has closed. Not dramatic, quiet, but present and unmistakable. He looked at Patterson. Patterson looked at him. 11 years of knowing each other. 7 years of professional relationship. The one time 3 years ago that Patterson had called him at 2 in the morning to say that Patricia had coded in the ICU and that the team needed him to come in and that he needed to know now before he got there whether there was anything else that could be done. Marcus had said with the specific care that question required, "There is. Come in, let me show you." What Patterson's face said now in the hallway of a police station at 11 in the evening was a version of the same thing in reverse. Marcus walked out of the cell. The hallway was crowded, more crowded than hallways like this were supposed to be at this hour. He looked at the assembled faces, Weems with his careful professionalism, Holbrook with his federal efficiency, Coates with her quiet readiness. The two officers against the wall who were looking at the floor with the particular attention of people who have concluded that the floor is currently the safest thing to look at. And Crane standing in the middle of the hallway with his hands at his sides. Marcus came to a stop 3 feet in front of him. He looked at Crane for 4 seconds. Not a long time, long enough. He saw in Crane's face the specific rearrangement that happens when a person's model of a situation encounters a reality that the model did not anticipate and cannot accommodate. Not the model of this evening specifically, the model of himself, of his own authority, his own judgment, his own reading of who the man in the dark blue Jeep on Meridian Drive was and what that man deserved. Crane had operated from that model with complete confidence for 9 years, and the confidence had been in his own estimation validated by the chain of command that had signed off on his complaints, by the command climate that had made his behavior possible and unremarkable, by every evening that had proceeded without consequence. Tonight had consequences. Marcus held Crane's gaze long enough to let that be visible. Not to enjoy it. He was not the kind of person who enjoyed it. He was the kind of person who, having spent 2 hours and 11 minutes in a cell, composing the most accurate possible accounting of what had happened, needed the person responsible to understand at the physical, present, unavoidable level what they had done and who had been looking back at them the entire time. 4 seconds. Then Marcus looked away, toward Holbrook, toward the process that came next. The reckoning had begun. The occasion, he felt, was sufficiently explained by the people standing behind him and the federal credentials now visible in 2 sets of hands. He simply looked at Crane with the specific expression of a man who has been given exactly what he needed and who is in no hurry to point out what it is. Crane said nothing. Holbrook stepped forward. "Sergeant Crane," he said, his voice even and distinctly professional. "I'm Special Agent Terrence Holbrook, FBI, Atlanta. My office has been contacted regarding the detention of Dr. Marcus Ellison this evening. We're going to need access to your incident reports, dash camera footage from the stop, and any communications related to this matter. Tonight." Crane swallowed. Your chief has been notified," Holbrook said. "Chief Burgess is on his way in." The silence that followed that statement had a particular quality. Not dramatic. Something heavier than dramatic. Like the weight of an institutional structure realizing all at once that its load-bearing assumptions had been wrong. Here's the thing that gets me every time. The system that was supposed to protect Marcus was the same one holding him in that cell. And it took someone calling in favors earned over decades of service to cut through it. Does that sit right with you? Should it require a general and an FBI agent for a man to be treated with basic decency? Tell me what you think in the comments. Hit the like button if you've been on the edge of your seat, and subscribe our channel so you don't miss what happens next. What Sergeant Victor Crane did not know, what he could not have known, because he had not performed the most basic investigative function of running the name of the man he arrested against the state and federal databases available to any officer in the processing room, was any of the following. Dr. Marcus Ellison was not simply a surgeon at Mercy General Hospital. He was the chief of vascular surgery, a position he had held for 7 years after being recruited from the Cleveland Clinic by the hospital's board of directors. He was the author of 43 peer-reviewed publications in vascular surgery, trauma care, and medical ethics. He was a fellow of the American College of Surgeons. He was a member of the Medical Advisory Committee for the Georgia Department of Public Health. He had twice been invited to testify before subcommittees of the United States Senate regarding disparities in trauma care access. He had 3 years ago operated on the wife of Brigadier General Raymond Patterson, retired, when she presented with a thoracic aortic dissection that 3 other surgeons in 3 cities had declined to attempt. He also held and had held for 9 years a special consultant designation with the Army Medical Command, granted at the specific request of General Patterson during his tenure as commanding general, which classified him under a federal administrative protocol as a subject matter expert to military medicine. That protocol had a specific provision drafted by the Army's Judge Advocate General and never used outside of a military context, which allowed for the invocation of federal interest in any matter involving the consultant's detention by civilian law enforcement. Marcus had known about this protocol for 9 years. He had hoped in that time never to need it. Crane also did not know that the citizen who had called 911 to report a suspicious individual, the call that had been referenced as justification for the stop, had, according to a review of the dispatch records that Diane Coates from the U.S. Attorney's Office pulled within 30 minutes of arriving, made 6 similar calls in the past 18 months, all describing black individuals in the Whitmore Hills neighborhood, none of which had resulted in any documented criminal activity. All 6 had been answered by officers from the Hartwell Crossing Department. 3 had been answered by Crane himself. He did not know any of this because he had not looked. He had looked at a black man in a dark blue Jeep driving through a white neighborhood at 33 miles per hour, and he had made a set of decisions based entirely on what he saw with his eyes and what he believed in some fundamental and apparently unconsidered part of himself that what he saw entitled him to do. That was the entirety of it. That was the whole architecture of the evening. And now he was standing in the hallway of his own station with an FBI agent asking for his incident reports and a U.S. Attorney's investigator asking for his documentation, and a retired Army general looking at him with an expression that required no translation, and the whole architecture was coming apart at exactly the rate that poorly built things come apart when properly examined. Chief Dale Burgess arrived at 11:43 in the evening. Marcus watched him come through the lobby door. Heavy-set man 60s wearing civilian clothes over a posture that was still attempting to project authority from a position that authority had already vacated. He looked at the lobby at the federal credentials at Patterson at Marcus, standing free near the processing desk, and something went out of his face. Not the authority, the certainty behind it. Patterson stepped forward. "Chief Burgess," he said, "thank you for coming in." Burgess looked at him. "General Patterson." His voice was careful in a way that careful voices become when they're making calculations very quickly. "I wasn't aware we had a situation." "You do now," Patterson said simply. "Diane." He nodded to Coates. Diane Coates stepped forward. She had said perhaps 7 words since arriving, but she moved with the particular economy of someone who is accustomed to being the person in the room whose words matter most. "Chief Burgess," she said, "my name is Diane Coates. I'm an investigator with the U.S. Attorney's Office. We're opening a preliminary inquiry into the circumstances of tonight's detention. I'm going to need to speak with you and with Sergeant Crane before either of you leave the building." The room was very quiet. Burgess looked at Crane. Whatever passed between them in that look was not readable from the outside. Then Burgess looked at Marcus. Marcus held his gaze, said nothing. He did not need to. The preliminary inquiry became a full federal civil rights investigation within 48 hours. Special Agent Holbrook's office requested and received all dash cam footage from the stop, all dispatch records for the evening of November 8th, all prior incident reports generated by Sergeant Victor Crane in his 9 years with the Hartwell Crossing Department, and all internal communications related to the 6 prior 911 calls originating from the same address in Whitmore Hills. What the investigation found, in the words of the federal inquiry report that would be released 4 months later, was a documented pattern of racially selective traffic enforcement operating under the institutional protection of command-level leadership that consistently failed to review, escalate, or correct reported officer conduct. The specifics were extensive. Sergeant Crane had conducted 41 traffic stops in Whitmore Hills over a 3-year period. 37 of them involved drivers who were black or Hispanic. Of those 37 stops, only 11 resulted in citations. Of those 11 citations, 8 were later challenged and dismissed for insufficient probable cause. In the 3 years prior, Crane had written exactly 1 citation in Whitmore Hills for a driver who was not a person of color. That citation had been for an expired registration and had been issued to a man who had reportedly been rude to Crane at a department community meeting. Chief Burgess's internal review records showed that he had received 2 formal complaints about Crane from members of the Hartwell Crossing community in the preceding 3 years. Both complaints had been filed by black residents. Both had been classified as unfounded following what the inquiry report described as reviews that were procedurally insufficient and appear to have been conducted without any independent examination of available evidence. Translation Burgess had signed off on findings that protected Crane without looking at the actual record. Officer Rollins, the second officer at the stop, the one who had watched Crane's face rather than Marcus's, the one who had noted the couple across the street with their phones out, filed a separate account with the inquiry investigators. Her account corroborated Marcus's entirely. She further stated that she had on 2 prior occasions raised concerns to her immediate supervisor about what she described as enforcement patterns that did not appear based on observed conduct, and that on both occasions she had been told to focus on her own assignments. She provided the names of her supervisors. Both were named in the investigation. Marcus cooperated fully with the inquiry. He provided a written account reviewed by his attorney that ran to 11 pages and documented every detail from the moment the cruiser appeared in his rearview mirror to the moment he walked out of the holding cell. He had noted times, names, room numbers, words, spoken as close to verbatim as he could reconstruct them, and the contents of each room he had been in. It read like a surgical report, precise, sequential, unsentimental. His attorney, a civil rights attorney in Atlanta named Josephine Tarrant, who had been recommended to Marcus by Constance Webb, and who turned out to be exactly the kind of person you want in your corner when the corner needs defending, read the 11 pages and said, "You documented this like a case file." "I treat everything like a case file," Marcus said. "Good," she said, "because we're going to build a very good case from it." The formal disciplinary hearings for Sergeant Victor Crane and Chief Dale Burgess began on a Tuesday in March, 4 months after the November stop. They were not conducted by the Hartwell Crossing Department. They were conducted by the Georgia Peace Officer Standards and Training Council, which had jurisdiction over officer certification under federal oversight from the Civil Rights Division. The hearing room was a conference room in a state office building in Atlanta, with fluorescent lights and a long table, and the particular atmosphere of a room where institutional accountability is being conducted by people who have read every document in the case file and are asking questions from a position of complete information. Marcus attended. He sat in the gallery with Josephine Tarrant on his right and Constance Webb on his left, and he watched the proceedings with the same attention he brought to a difficult case in the OR, tracking every detail, noting every hesitation, understanding the structure of what was happening and where it was likely to go. Crane was represented by a union attorney who had spent the morning making procedural objections that the hearing panel sustained none of. Crane's testimony lasted 3 hours. He described the stop as a response to a dispatched call about suspicious activity. He described his probable cause as the totality of the circumstances. He described Marcus's behavior as initially non-compliant, which was directly contradicted by the dash cam footage, which was played twice for the panel, in which Marcus's behavior was visible as fully compliant from the first moment the cruiser appeared behind him. When the panel chair, a woman named Dr. Abernathy, who had a background in criminal justice policy and who conducted the entire proceeding with a level of quiet precision that Marcus found professionally admirable, asked Crane to identify the specific non-compliant behavior he had observed. Crane's attorney objected. The objection was overruled. Crane said he had an attitude. The room was very quiet after that. "An attitude," Dr. Abernathy said, in a tone that did not modulate. "Can you describe what that looked like?" Crane could not. Chief Burgess testified in the afternoon. His attorney spent considerable time establishing Burgess's years of service and community engagement. The panel spent considerable time on the 2 prior complaints filed against Crane and the documentation trail, or lack thereof, in Burgess's review of those complaints. They asked Burgess to walk them through his review process. He described a process. They showed him the review files. The review files did not support the process he had described. When asked directly whether he had reviewed the dashcam footage or dispatch records from either prior complaint, Burgess said he had delegated that review to a lieutenant. "Which lieutenant?" Dr. Abernathy asked. Burgess gave a name. The panel had already spoken to that lieutenant. The lieutenant had no record of receiving that delegation. The panel showed Burgess the lieutenant's written statement to that effect. The silence that followed was not the silence of a man who has been caught in a lie. It was the silence of a man who has suddenly seen in complete detail the structure of the thing he built without ever having thought clearly about what it was. The GPSTC panel issued its findings 11 days after the hearing concluded. Sergeant Victor Crane's certification revoked. He would never again work in law enforcement in the state of Georgia. Chief Dale Burgess, certification revoked. Additionally, the panel referred the matter to the county district attorney's office with a recommendation that Burgess's conduct in the 2 prior complaint reviews be examined for potential criminal obstruction. 6 other officers whose names appeared in the investigation's pattern, documentation officers who had conducted stops flagged as potentially discriminatory, and whose reports had been signed off on by Burgess without independent review, received mandatory retraining requirements and probationary status pending further review. Officer Rollins received a commendation for cooperation with the investigation. She was, as a practical matter, the only officer in the Hartwell Crossing Department whose record emerged from the process clean. The county district attorney's examination of Burgess's conduct in the prior complaint reviews resulted 3 months later in an indictment on 2 counts of official misconduct. Burgess entered a negotiated plea misdemeanor, dereliction of duty, 6 months suspended, sentence a fine and a permanent bar from holding any public safety administrative position in Georgia. The civil suit filed by Josephine Tarrant on Marcus's behalf against Hartwell Crossing County was settled before the first hearing date. The county's attorneys took 3 weeks to conclude that proceeding to trial against the documented record, the dash cam footage, the dispatch records, the pattern documentation, the federal inquiry findings, and Marcus's 11-page account, which Tarrant had structured into a filing that a legal journalist covering the case described as one of the most methodically constructed civil rights complaints I've seen in 20 years of coverage, was not a viable strategy. The settlement figure was not disclosed publicly per the terms of the agreement. Marcus instructed Josephine Tarrant to donate a specific portion of it, the figure he had calculated as representing 1 year of the Hartwell Crossing Police Department's entire overtime budget, as publicly disclosed in their last 3 annual reports, to a legal aid organization in Atlanta that provided civil rights representation to individuals who could not afford private counsel. "I want it to be that number specifically," Marcus told Tarrant. She asked why. "Because I want the math to mean something," Marcus said. The morning after the story broke publicly, there had been a brief piece in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution citing the federal inquiry findings and the GPSTC panel results, and the piece had been shared broadly enough that by the following morning it was national news. Marcus was in Operating Room 4 at Mercy General at 6:47 in the morning. Different patient, same board, same red marker, same Dolores at the whiteboard. His hands did not shake. They never shook in the OR. They hadn't shaken when he stood at the booking desk in the Hartwell Crossing station either. That steadiness was not a performance. It was the thing his life had built into him year by year, case by case, through every room that had asked him to be steady when it would have been easier not to be. What had changed was outside the OR. The Hartwell Crossing Police Department operated under interim leadership for 7 months, following Burgess's resignation. The county commissioned an independent structural review. The review resulted in a 48-page report that was, per the county commissioner's instruction, posted publicly in full on the county's website. The recommendations included an independent civilian oversight board, a mandatory revision of the probable cause documentation process, a new protocol requiring supervisory co-signature on all stops in residential neighborhoods, and the establishment of a community liaison office funded from the overtime budget that had been identified in the audit as consistently exceeding its allocation without corresponding productivity documentation. Whether all of those recommendations would be implemented fully and maintained over time and survive the pressures that institutional change always eventually faces, that was a question that could not yet be answered. Marcus was not naive about institutional reform. He had spent 21 years inside institutions, and he understood that documents could be filed without changing behavior, and that oversight boards could exist without having teeth, and that the distance between a written policy and a daily practice was often considerable. But it was a start. It was a start built from a record that could not be disputed, a process that had been conducted in full view of federal oversight, and a set of findings that were now part of the permanent administrative history of Hartwell Crossing County. That was something. It was not everything, but it was something. 3 weeks after the GPS-TC panel issued its findings, Marcus received a letter, handwritten, 3 pages. It was from Dorothea Cleaves. She had read about what happened. She had found his name in the article. She had asked her daughter to help her find an address where she could write to him. The letter was about what happened to her in Operating Room 3 in November, and what happened afterward, and the physical therapy sessions, and the way walking felt different now than it had felt before, which she described as strange, because she had not known before that walking could feel like this, like something deliberately done rather than automatic. She wrote about her sister who had flown in from Houston and slept on the fold-out in the hospital room for 6 days. She wrote about a dream she had had during recovery that she described as vivid and specific in a way she couldn't entirely articulate. And at the end of the second page, before the final page, she wrote, "I want you to know that I was there. I didn't know it at the time. I was somewhere between here and not here, and I don't know exactly where, but I felt like someone was fighting for me. I felt it very specifically, and I woke up." She closed by saying she was going to her granddaughter's school play in February. She had never missed one. She was very glad she was not going to miss this one. Marcus read the letter twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it in the drawer of his desk where he kept the letters. He sat at his desk for a moment with the drawer open, looking at the other envelopes in there, a few dozen of them accumulated over years, from patients and their families, some short and some long, all of them containing the specific weight of a moment that had been serious enough for someone to sit down and write, not email. Write. He had never been able to throw any of them away. He was not sure he had ever fully understood why, until right now holding Dorothea Cleaves's 3 pages, when it occurred to him that what these letters collectively constituted was a record, a parallel record to the surgical notes and the outcome data and the peer-reviewed publications running alongside all of it, written in a different language, the language of what it had meant to the person on the table. There were others in there, other letters, from other patients over the years, the particular correspondence of a career spent in rooms where the stakes were as high as stakes could be. He sat at his desk for a few minutes. Then he thought about the red marker on Dolores's whiteboard, about the morning's cases, about the second life he had saved on the same day that someone had put him in a cell for the crime of being black in a neighborhood where people had decided without evidence and without examination that he did not belong. He thought about his father's voice in the parking lot in Memphis when he was 16 years old, the instructions for survival that he had been carrying since before he understood what they were. He had carried them for 32 years without being able to set them down, without being asked whether he wanted to carry them, without anyone who had given him those instructions having any choice about giving them. He thought about his daughter who would be leaving for college in 9 months, who had asked him over dinner the week before, "Dad, are you okay? Like actually okay?" He had looked at her across the table and thought, as he often did, about how precisely she phrased questions. "I'm exactly okay," he had said, "and I'm going to tell you the whole story someday, but not tonight." She had looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was 30% his and 70% her own, and she had said, "Okay, but I want to hear it." "You will," he said. The story did not end with that dinner, and it did not end with the letter from Dorothea Cleves, and it did not end with the settlement or the certification revocations or the 48-page county report or the federal inquiry findings. Stories like this one do not have endings in that sense. They have consequences, and those consequences have consequences, and the chain extends outward in ways that can only be tracked partially and understood incompletely and are never fully finished. What Marcus Ellison knew, sitting at his desk on a February morning with Dorothea Cleves's 3 pages in his hand, was this: he had remained himself throughout the whole of it, in the holding cell and in the processing room and in the hallway, when Crane stood in front of him with an expression that had become recognition of consequence. He had remained to the extent that a person can remain anything precisely under the accumulated pressure of a night designed to reduce him to something smaller than what he was himself. And in the morning he would go back into the OR and he would check the board and there would be names in red and the work would begin again. That was what he knew. That was what he had always known. That was the whole of it. 12 months after November 8th, Hartwell Crossing looked from the road more or less as it had always looked. The oak-lined streets were still oak-lined. The freshly painted fences were freshly painted again, because fences in neighborhoods like this one were repainted on a schedule. The Chick-fil-A on the commercial strip was still there, and the Target and the Home Depot and the chain restaurants in between. The Whitmore Hills neighborhood watch signs were still on the corners. What had changed was not visible from the road. The police department had a new chief, a woman named Commander Angela Reeves, hired from Atlanta PD's Community Liaison Division, who had spent her first 30 days in the role not making arrests or issuing directives, but attending every public meeting, neighborhood association, gathering, and community event on the calendar for Hartwell Crossing. She had introduced herself as someone who was there to listen before she was there to lead, and the community had received this with a cautious attention that was in itself a form of response to what had come before. The Oversight Board met for the first time in February. 11 community members, 3 county administrators, and 2 retired law enforcement officials who had applied and been vetted through a process that the county commissioner had insisted be conducted by an external HR firm rather than internally. The meetings were public and held in the community center on Thornbury Road. The first one had 42 attendees. The second had 67. Marcus attended neither, not because he was not interested, because he was interested in them succeeding more than he was interested in being seen at them. He had submitted a written statement to the board's inaugural meeting, a 1-page document that outlined without elaboration what he believed the board's mandate should be, and why he believed the documentation process was the most critical element of meaningful oversight. He had signed it as a resident of Whitmore Hills, not as a physician, or as the subject of a federal civil rights inquiry. The statement was read aloud at the meeting by the board chair. It was applauded. Marcus was in OR Suite 4 when that happened and didn't know about it until his daughter told him over dinner. Officer Rollins transferred to the county sheriff's office in January, where her record stood without the shadow of the Hartwell Crossing Department's history. She filed a formal harassment complaint against the 2 officers who had, in the months following her cooperation with the investigation, made her working conditions in the department effectively untenable. The complaint was substantiated. Both officers received formal discipline. One resigned, one was placed on probationary status. Rollins sent Marcus a text message through a mutual contact that said simply, "I did the right thing, I'd do it again." He had shown the text to his daughter, who had been asking with increasing specificity to hear the whole story. He told her, "Not all at once. Over 3 evenings after dinner, with the television off and the kitchen table between them, and the kind of attention from her that reminded him she was whatever else she was, the kind of person who listened completely. He told her about the cruiser in his rearview mirror, and the handcuffs, and the cell, and the running log he had kept in his head, and Weems with the water bottle and Patterson walking through the lobby. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she sat for a moment. "Dad," she said. "Yeah, you were keeping that log the whole time, the mental one, the whole time." She shook her head slowly, and then something shifted in her face that was a combination of recognition and a kind of sorrow that was too mature for 17, and also, he thought, exactly right for 17. "You must have been so tired." "I was," he said. "Not from the OR," she said. "No," he said, "not from the OR." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I want to be like that. When something is wrong and scary, I want to be like that, keeping the log, not losing it." "You already are," he said. She didn't believe him. He could see that she didn't believe him. She would, eventually. It was the kind of thing that took years to understand about yourself. Marcus drove home that night with the window down, slightly letting the November air move through the car, not because it was warm enough for that, because he needed the sensation of forward motion to be physical, real present in a way that the inside of the car, with its recycled warmth and familiar smell, was not quite providing. He thought about his daughter in the kitchen with the question on her face, about the specific courage it takes at 17 to ask your parent whether they are actually okay, and to mean it seriously enough to sit with the silence while they decide whether to answer honestly. She had her mother's directness in that way, the willingness to ask the thing that needed asking and wait as long as it took for an answer. He had always admired it. He had always found it slightly disarming. He was a man who organized his responses carefully, who understood the structure of a conversation before he entered it, and she was one of the few people in his life who could ask him something and make him need to actually think before he answered. He thought, "I'm going to be fine," and then he thought with slightly more precision, "I have always been fine in the sense that matters. I have continued. I have done the work." The cell did not change any of that. Crane's face in the hallway did not change any of that. The handcuffs on Meridian Drive at 33 miles per hour did not change any of that. What they changed was the record, and the record now included what happened to it. Marcus still drove the same route home, still set his cruise control to 33 on Meridian Drive, though the reason for that particular number had changed, or rather it had added a meaning to the original one. It was still his father's rule, but it was also now a record. 33 miles per hour on Meridian Drive, documented in his personal log the same way everything was documented. Because documentation is how the past becomes legible to the future. Because legibility is how accountability becomes possible. Because accountability is in the end what turns an injustice from something that simply happened into something that cannot simply continue. He thought about Dorothea Cleves on her granddaughter's school performance, walking in on her own. He thought about the letter in his desk drawer. He thought about the red names on Dolores's whiteboard in the morning. He drove home, the same route, the same speed, the same hands on the wheel. Different night. If you're watching this and something in it sits heavy, that's not an accident, because this story, while fictional, reflects something real. The particular weight of being seen as a threat before you're seen as a person, of carrying survival instructions you never asked for, of having to be twice as composed, twice as documented, twice as connected just to access the same basic treatment that everyone should receive as a matter of course. We tell stories like this one not because fiction fixes anything, but because sometimes a story can make visible what statistics can't. Sometimes it takes a specific face, a specific night, a specific hallway for people to understand what "this happens" actually means when it happens to a real person in a real place. If this story moved you, hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe our channel, because we're committed to bringing you stories that make you think, that make you feel, and that refuse to look away. Justice doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it walks into a station lobby in a dark overcoat and asks quietly where a man is being held. And sometimes that's enough. Thank you for watching this story with us. These stories matter not just as entertainment, but as a way of holding a mirror up to the world and asking whether what we see is what we want to keep. We appreciate that you stayed to the end. It means something. See you in the next one.